We do not admire the man of timid peace. We admire the man who embodies victorious effort. Theodore Roosevelt, 1899, The Strenuous Life. Did American imperialism in the late 19th and early 20th century mark the country's beginnings as a global superpower? Imperialism in Cuba. In the late 19th century, the people of Cuba initiated a revolt against the Spanish Empire. Newspaper reports in America revealed the terrible acts the empire was doing against the Cubans and Americans in Cuba as well. Eager to help, the USS Maine was sent as a relief vessel protect American interests. However, on February 15, 1898, while docked in the Havana harbor, the battleship exploded, killing over 200 sailors. With no real cause of the explosion identified, U.S. newspapers and mass media blamed the explosion of the USS Maine on the Spanish Empire, simply because there was no other explanation. This process of exaggerating confusing events became known as yellow journalism, and furthered the cause for Congress to declare war on the empire. About the time news of the USS Maine had made headlines throughout the country, a respected senator, Redfield Proctor, traveled to Cuba on a fact-finding mission. Known for his honesty and objectivity, he gave Congress a report that propelled President McKinley to war. I went to Cuba with the strong conviction that the picture had been overdrawn. I could not believe that out of a population of 1,600,000, 200,000 had died within these Spanish forts. My inquiries were entirely outside of sensational sources. What I saw I cannot tell so that others can see it. It must be seen with one's own eyes to be realized. To me, the strongest appeal is not the barbarity practiced by a whaler, nor the loss of the Maine, but the spectacle of 1.5 million people, the entire native population of Cuba, struggling for freedom and deliverance from the worst misgovernment which I ever had knowledge. On April 11, 1898, shortly after the Proctor Report, President McKinley asked Congress for the power to stop the bloodshed in Cuba. Among the grounds for intervention, the President listed the following. First, in the cause of humanity and to put an end to the barbarities, bloodshed, starvation, and horrible miseries now existing there, and which the parties to the conflict are unable or unwilling to stop or mitigate. Second, we owe it to our citizens in Cuba to afford them that protection and amenity for life and property which no government there can or will afford. Third, the right to intervene may be justified by the serious injury to the commerce, trade, and business of our people. 8 days later, the U.S. House and Senate were prepared to vote on a declaration of war on Spain. Senator Henry Teller drew up a resolution accompanying such a declaration. It will commit the U.S. to free Cuba and pledge the U.S. not to keep or govern it. First, that the people of the island of Cuba are and of right ought to be free and independent. Second, that it is the duty of the United States to demand, and the government of the United States does hereby demand, that the government of Spain at once relinquish its authority and government in the island of Cuba and withdraw its land and navy forces from Cuba and Cuban waters. Third, that the President of the United States be and hereby is directed and empowered to use the entire land and navy force of the United States to carry these resolutions into effect. Fourth, that the United States hereby disclaims any disposition or intervention to exercise control over said island, and to leave the government control of the island to its people. On April 25, 1898, the U.S. declared war on Spain for the purpose of freeing Cuba. America's first hostile act, however, was to launch an attack on the Spanish fleet in the Philippines, about 13,000 miles from Cuba. Now why, one might ask, would the U.S. begin a war to free Cuba by attacking a country 13,000 miles away? That answer is that Assistant Secretary of the Navy and future President Theodore Roosevelt had telegraphed orders to Admiral George Dewey, who was stationed in Hong Kong on the China coast, instructing him to destroy the Spanish fleet in the Philippines as soon as war with Spain was declared. According to these orders, Dewey left Hong Kong and arrived in Manila on April 20th, 1898. There he maneuvered with great skill through a base seated with mines and prepared to do battle with the 10-ship Spanish fleet. Badly outgunned, almost all of the Spanish fleet was sunk, and more than 381 Spanish soldiers had been killed. Admiral Dewey had no army at his command in Manila. He therefore could not follow up on his decisive naval victory with an attack on Spanish forces in the capital. However, when he left Hong Kong for Manila, he had brought Emilio Aguinaldo, a Philippine patriot, with him. Dewey brought Aguinaldo back in the hopes that he could help the U.S. beat Spain. Aguinaldo organized an effective armed force that started to encircle Spanish forces in Manila, but when 11,000 American soldiers arrived 6 weeks later, they replaced the Filipino army commanded by Aguinaldo. Subsequently, the Americans and not the Filipinos accepted the surrender of the Spanish and proceeded to occupy Manila. The U.S. did not allow Filipino troops in the capital city of their own country, thereby creating a serious problem between the Filipinos who were fighting for their own freedom and Americans who supposedly had come to freedom. At the same time, the U.S. Army, under General Shafter, set sail for Cuba. They landed safely and completed unloading in 5 days. With the help from Cuban forces, an army of some 17,000 Americans, accompanied by 89 reporters, advanced towards Santiago, 20 miles away. Two hills, A Caney and San Juan Hill, overlooked the road to Santiago. The hills were taken by a cavalry regiment, personally recruited and led by Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, and are known as the Rough Riders. With the successes at San Juan and El Caney, Admiral Cervera of the Spanish Empire was ordered to break out of Santiago Harbor. He set sail on July 3, 1898, and he was immediately hammered by a vastly superior American fleet under Admiral Sampson in a battle that was as one-sided as Dewey's victory at Manila Harbor. With the destruction of Cervera's fleet, the Spanish forces in Cuba were left with no other receiving either supplies or reinforcements. Thus Spain felt it had no choice but to surrender its army of 200,000 men to a far smaller force of American and Cuban soldiers. The date of the surrender was July 16, 1898. Exactly 2 weeks later, Puerto Rico also fell into U.S. hands. After winning the war with Spain, the U.S. needed to decide to do what these new islands. Under the Teller Resolution, the U.S. would have to free Cuba. But regarding Puerto Rico and the Philippines, President McKinley thought long and hard about what to do. He eventually decided to buy both the islands, along with the island of Guam, from Spain for $20 million. The treaty with Spain was completed in December 1899 and then sent to the U.S. Senate to be ratified. However, a debate in the U.S. Senate soon followed on the issue of whether the U.S. should actually keep the Philippines and Puerto Rico. Among the most important questions the Senate was asked to consider were: does the U.S. have a right and/or a duty to rule other countries, or does owning colonies violate the principles upon which the U.S. was founded? Would the U.S. benefit economically from keeping the Philippines, or would these islands offer little chance for profit and cost a great deal to defend? Would possessing the Philippines, over some 8,000 miles from California, contribute to the defense of the United States, or just create a burden for taxpayers and increase the chance of the U.S. going to war? The debate sparked responses from Senator Teller, Senator McLaurin, Senator Lodge, and Senator Caffrey. All four senators had varying opinions and varying viewpoints on the U.S.'s future course of actions, and added their own personal questions as the future of the U.S. as a global superpower in years to come. So, did American imperialism mark the country's beginnings as a global superpower? Well, after winning these new islands, the US had shown to the rest of the world that they too could be a major naval and military force. And now the country had new mediums with which they could buy, sell, and trade new products. New investments opened up in the Philippines, and the country was also able to establish the Panama Canal, so businesses could reach parts of the world they never could before.